This is a short story about a drive I did in 1977 from Kuwait to Reading in the UK, and it's entitled 4,000 miles in 7 days solo, or an idiot in a fantastic car. I only ventured out to do necessary shopping and a few times to see my daughters. I spent Christmas Day with my parents in Wiltshire, New Year watching a bit of television and not much else. I just felt worn out. It didn't cross my mind that I would have to go get my life back on track. Days came and went. No plans, no purpose, nothing. Then in January 1977 I went back to Kuwait on my own account, and that was how the drive came about. Whilst working in Kuwait previously, I'd bought a second-hand 1969 Mercedes-Benz 280 SL, and that was the car I used during the time I was there on my own account. By November time, my health was much improved, and I felt it was time to get my work life back in order. To do that, I felt it better to return to the UK. Chapter 3. The long drive. I'd drive the Mercedes back to the UK, I decided. That was my plan, but there were a number of things I needed to prepare first. The car needed a service. In fact, more than just a service, the fuel pump needed some work, and I wanted to make sure the car was good for such a journey. I needed to plan the route, check what visas I would need, and get a carte de passage for the car. My plan was to follow the TIR route as far as Germany. That way there was a good chance I would meet some British lorries if I had any problems. A number of people I spoke to advised me against doing it on my own, some against doing it altogether, and others just said, good luck with that. As far as I could make out, the only visa I needed to get before departure was for Syria. It would take about a week, I was told by their embassy. I completed the application form and left my passport with them. A week later, I collected the passport, which now boasted a full-page transit visa, complete with postage stamps and rubber stamp marks. It all very official, and of course, all in Arabic, which I couldn't read. The carte de voyage, or carte de passage, for the car proved no problem to obtain, so it seemed all the paperwork was done. I put the car into a local Mercedes garage in Ahmadi, an oil-based town south of Kuwait City, and told the German senior mechanic what I intended to do. He understood I needed a very reliable car and told me to leave it with him for a few days. A few days, and about £2,000 later, he had the car ready. They had rebuilt the engine. When I went to collect the car, the German mechanic told me that he hadn't taken it for a road test. Would I like to go with him? We went, him driving. He took the car onto a long stretch of dual carriageway and raced the engine to its limits in all gears. "Hang on," I cried. "I want to drive this car back to England, and you've just rebuilt the engine. If a Mercedes engine won't stand this, it's no good," he told me with a nice German smile, still keeping his foot hard down on the accelerator. He took it up to over 120 miles an hour, and I kept my fingers crossed that he was right. It turned out he was. What a lovely man. In Kuwait Souk, that's a marketplace, I bought a roof rack and 2 galvanised steel trunks, which I painted black and bolted to the roof rack. It had a lot of stuff to take home, including lots of tools and 2 guitars. I can't remember the actual date, or the day of the week, but I was finally ready to go. Thinking back now, I realised that the health of my mind was not yet fully recovered, because the only person I told of my departure was my good friend Mustafa, who had sponsored my time in Kuwait. He didn't know my route or intended timing of the journey, It was long in the days before mobile phones or the internet and all the other means of communication that we now have today. If anything had happened to me, no one would have realised I was missing for a very long time. The only precautions I had taken was to buy an extremely strong trigger-operated halogen search lamp which plugged into the cigarette lighter, and as many cartons of cigarettes as I could pack into the back behind the seat. Those were in case I needed to bribe somebody. The evening before departure, I loaded the car. 2 steel trunks were full of the lighter stuff, the boot was full, the rear passenger space was crammed full. I left the passenger seat empty, apart from a few bits I might want to get hold of quickly and could be stuffed behind the seat when I wanted to sleep in the car. I paid the landlord who owned the block of apartments to which the service quarters that I had been living in belonged. He occupied the main block, living there with his 3 wives and all his children. At 5 o'clock the following morning, I had my last breakfast in Kuwait, consisting of the last packet of cornflakes, the last of the milk and sugar, so that the fridge and the last cupboard were empty. I was ready to drive away at 6 o'clock. I'd been living several miles south of Kuwait City, so about an hour later I arrived at the western border between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The roads were excellent. 2-lane dual carriageways right up to the border where, without any warning, it ended. Just like that. Ahead of me was the desert and numerous porta cabins scattered in no apparent order. It was as if they'd been delivered and dumped wherever the lorry carrying them had become stuck in the sand. Actually, it's not real sand. It's a nasty combination of dirt, dust, the odd rock, and what looks like sand. It's called gatch. There were TIR lorries from all the countries of Europe, including some from the UK. After making some inquiries, I managed to find the right porta cabins to go through the process of leaving the country with the car. But now I had to get to the Saudi border. There was no road, no signs, just a series of tracks leading off into the desert. I found a British TIR truck with the driver sitting in his cab, and I asked him which way to the Saudi border post. "Climb up here, mate," he told me. I climbed up into his cab and looked in the direction he was pointing. "See that building over there?" I looked, and in the far distance I could just make out a building. "That's it," he said. "Which track should I take?" I asked. "Take your pick," was his reply. "They all end up in the same place. Good luck." We had a little chat during which he told me that he'd been there for 2 days waiting for the paperwork to be cleared and might be there for a couple more days. I thanked him and went back to my car. "Well, here goes," I thought to myself as I started the engine and picked at random a track to follow. The car was well overloaded and with very little ground clearance under the back axle, so I was great care and driving extremely slowly, I made my way in the direction of the Saudi border post. It turned out to be just one substantial building, and without hardly a glance at the paperwork, the officer stamped my passport and carte de voyage, and I was through my first border crossing. Ahead of me lay over 800 miles to the border with Jordan. To get me from Kuwait through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria and up to the Turkish border, this was my map, 1,200 miles, and this is the bit I did in the first day, about 900 miles. The car was doing about 18 miles to the gallon, mainly due to the weight I was asking it to carry, which meant that a tank full of petrol would get me nearly 300 miles. My map for this section of the trip consisted of one sheet of paper printed in black and white with a few lines on it, the names of some villages, lines showing the borders and where the fuel stations were. They were approximately every 150 miles. Taking no chances, I decided to fill up the tank at every refuelling place. The road was all single carriageway with a surprising amount of traffic, mainly lorries, interspersed with mad car drivers and pickup drivers. The scenery was about as boring as you could imagine. Desert, desert, and more desert. The villages were little more than a small collection of corrugated steel buildings with the odd mud hut thrown in. I had with me some sandwiches I had made the night before and plenty to drink, but as the sun started to set and I had reached the mountainous region approaching Jordan, I stopped, lit the paraffin-fueled primer stove I had with me and heated a tin of soup. The air was cooler here and far more comfortable. The Merc had no air conditioning, and on the flatlands of the northern area of Saudi Arabia, in the pure desert, it was a toss-up between having the windows open and being blasted with hot air, or keeping them closed and being suffocated to death. I swapped between the two. This stop was the first proper rest I had taken since I started 12 hours before. I sat on a rock and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. Complete darkness came quickly, and when I felt able, I decided I would try for the border with Jordan. I arrived there about 11 p.m. The mileometer showed I had done just under 900 miles. There were only a few cars and lorries about, so I had no trouble passing out of Saudi, and then crossed no man's land to the border with Jordan and the border post. Again, fairly quiet, and I found an officer to deal with my entry to Jordan. He wanted to see the car. We walked to the car. He took one look and said, "Unload the car." What? Everything? Everything. I unloaded the car whilst he stood and watched. When I'd finished, he said, "Load the car and come into the office." At that, he turned and walked away. Ignorant. Something bleep, I thought. I reloaded the car. It took ages to get it back the way it had been, but eventually it all back in, including everything from the 2 trunks on the roof. In the office, he stamped my passport, etc., as if nothing had happened. The process had taken nearly 2 hours. The needle on the fuel gauge was bouncing off the empty pin. I asked where the fuel station was, and I was told it was just down the road, but was closed until the morning. About a mile down the road, I found the garage, parked on the forecourt next to the pump, and made myself as comfortable as possible in the front passenger seat. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was shattered. With a blanket draped over me, I was soon asleep, and I stayed that way until I was woken by a thumping on the car. The attendant had turned up for work, and there was a queue of cars waiting behind me. He filled the tank while I was stumbled out of the passenger seat. I paid him and set off once again with a full tank. This is my second leg of the journey, about 550 miles altogether. It was only about 100 miles across Jordan to my crossing point into Syria, and of course there wouldn't be any problem there because I already had a transit visa in my passport. With no problems at all, my journey across the northeastern bit of Jordan was quite pleasant. I stopped in a little village and broke my fast with whatever the little wayside cafe had to offer, which included tea, Arabic style, and stretched my legs and set off again.